The first thing you should know is this. The night it happened looked like any other summer night in Cedar Ridge, porch lights blinking on. The smell of cut grass drifting down the street. Neighbors putting out recycling. I was carrying a grocery bag. Laura was balancing 2 mugs of tea. And Lily, our little girl with the crooked smile and the white cane, was humming a song she'd learned at school. The one she liked to hum when she was thinking about butterflies. 3 sentences. That's all it took for a life to change a door. A scream. And the world rearranged itself around a single terrible sound. My name's Jack Mercer. I used to work cases long, clean, federal, and then I left that life for the quiet thing. For a little house with an oak tree and a daughter who could sing the alphabet backward for fun. People say you can't really leave that work. Not the way it becomes a muscle in you. They're right. It showed up that night anyway. Like a reflex and a wound all at once. We found Lily at the bottom of our driveway. Not like in stories where everything is cinematic and neat, just her sneakers turned the wrong way. Her cane beside her. And the way she was breathing like someone had put a pillow over her mouth. Blood on the pavement. I'm not going to linger there, I'll tell you what mattered. She was alive. And she was my daughter. And I could feel 2 parts of me snapping: the father who wanted to scoop her up and never let go. And the old agent who knew that time and evidence live on different clocks. That night the clock split. The next morning, while hospital lights hummed and machines kept track of breaths, I found a pattern. A neighbor's doorbell camera, the sort that sits on a little hook by the front door, and records. Everything had caught something. Not everything, but enough. A figure in the dark. A voice raised. The footage was grainy, like bad film, but you could hear someone shout commands. And then a thud. It matched no accident I'd ever seen. And there was a name that kept coming up in hushed tones around the cul-de-sac when people thought they were alone: Marjorie Hale. She was the president of the Cedar Ridge HOA. If you've lived near an HOA, you know the type. Neat hair. A smile practiced like a signature. A temper that sits behind pearl buttons. Marjorie liked to tell people how she kept the neighborhood safe. To her, safe meant tidy hedges, matching mailboxes, and strict rules about paint color. To others, safe meant people who kept their heads down, who didn't make waves. Marjorie had power. She had committees. She had bylaws. She had friends on the city council and a husband who made donations that got names on plaques. When someone with that much influence is accused of hurting a child, it doesn't play out like a small-town argument. Power rearranges the rules around itself to make a nice, neat cushion. We tried to talk to the local police. We did what anyone would do. The chief was polite. The sergeant was patient. And then there were pauses long enough to build a case for another explanation. Maybe it was a hit and run. Maybe something else. Maybe hostilities stirred in the wrong direction. I remember the detective's face when I said Marjorie's name. It went blank the way a screen does when the Wi-Fi drops. Those blank faces are where you learn the shape of a community's fear. You would think, given my past, that I'd jump right back into detective mode and fix everything. It's not that simple. The federal job taught me precision. It taught me that accusations are mortarless unless they're built on evidence. It taught me to be careful with grief. But grief is a different kind of fire. It makes people want to break things. I wanted to break something. I'll be honest. I wanted to break the person who did it. I wanted to break the rulebook that let them hide. Laura wanted me to be careful. She wanted me to be a father first. And so, for a while, I tried to hold both things at once: the quiet, careful investigator and the father whose chest felt like it had been hollowed out. There were small victories at first. The neighbor's camera, the one from the blue house on Elm, showed a Subaru pulling up where there shouldn't have been any cars. The timestamps matched the early hours. A woman with a scarf that slid when she moved. That detail would matter later. Then, other people started to talk. There's a strange courage that comes in numbers. An elderly man who'd lived on the street 20 years told me about fists on his fence and notices about barking dogs that had turned into letters demanding compliance. A young mother said the HOA levied fines against families who painted their houses incorrectly. A landscaper confessed he'd been told to leave if he didn't use the vendor Marjorie liked. What I felt then was not just the urge to punish one person. It was seeing the way power habitually squashed friction. It didn't just punish a child's laughter. It punished anyone who would risk being themselves in a community that ran on neatness. When we began to push when I used what I could to urge a formal investigation, the system made a face like someone biting down on a lemon. Insurance companies were called. Lawyers were consulted. And Marjorie's lawyer was old money in a new suit, smiling the way a shark's smile looks when it's polite. He asked questions that felt like boomerangs. He asked whether Lily had any prior injuries, whether she'd been in therapy, whether she could have fallen. He asked whether we had anything definitive: DNA, a weapon, a confession. He asked everything that would put us on the defense. If I'm honest, there were moments I felt clumsy, like a man trying to wield a scalpel when everyone else wielded sledgehammers. The DA wanted to avoid a witch hunt. The chief wanted to keep his department from being politicized. Marjorie's husband made a public statement about being devastated on his wife's behalf. In the middle of the statements, I started to hear my name in all sorts of whispers that "did you know he used to be" lines. Former FBI, ex-agent, was the way people framed it, as if it explained everything or absolved it. I wanted the cameras to see Lily's face, though not in the way those tabloids wanted. I wanted people to see her laugh, to hear her humming. That's what I wanted more than anything, for people to know who was missing. And then something happened that shifted everything. A neighbor's footage surfaced that was clear enough to freeze someone's breath. A ring of lights. Then a shape. The accused was not anonymous anymore. It was Marjorie, in a maroon coat that caught the streetlight like a warning. The video didn't prove intent. Not on its own. But it put a name to a figure we'd all whispered about. The DA called it probable cause. The county prosecutor called it sufficient for an arrest. People who had felt trapped began to feel seen. The arrest was a quiet thing. On paper, taken into custody. Booked. Processed, but the ripples were loud. Marjorie's neighbors were stunned into a sob that sounded like a chorus. Supporters gathered outside the community center, holding signs that said, "Preserve our values." And on the other side, people held candles for Lily. The internet did its thing, you know how that goes, and suddenly the story was everywhere. There was talk of civil suits, of HOA reform, of investigations into how much power an unpaid committee should really have. Courtroom scenes are never as neat as the movies. Evidence is a catalog of small, terrible truths, a smear here, a pattern there, a testimony that connects the dots you thought were separate. The defense tried everything to paint Marjorie as a woman of service, a volunteer who loved the neighborhood, to suggest the video was misinterpreted, to imply that an overzealous father might be projecting rage into the frame. They brought in character witnesses who talked about cookie exchanges and yearly barbecues. They had friends with well-placed positions and letters signed with cursive loops. But here's the thing about juries: you don't get them by reputation alone. You get them by details. You get them by showing that the individual moments, when stacked, form a chain. The DA played the neighbor testimonies, the landscaper's invoice, the pattern of calls, and crucially Marjorie's own statements to the HOA when she complained about unruly behavior on the Mercer property. That phrase, unruly behavior, hung in the courtroom like a scent you couldn't wash out. Because what does unruly mean when applied to a child who likes to hum? It starts to sound like a danger. There were moments in the trial that felt like knives. The defense tried to discredit Lily's memory, to make it seem like a child's recollection could be tainted. They asked whether she might have been influenced by someone to say certain things. A child's testimony is delicate. It needs protection, not manipulation. But Lily, bless her, had a way of speaking that was simple and honest. She described the sound of steps, the suddenness, the voice she remembered as sharp like an alarm. She didn't get into the kinds of details that court reporters love. She stayed steady, like a coastline, saying what was true for her. The day the jury went into deliberation felt like a held breath. It was long, and the people in the hallways whispered, and Marjorie sat like someone who'd been taught to keep composure. I sat with Laura outside the courthouse and watched a man in a suit tie the knot of his tie like he was trying to hold his own grief together. There's a scene that sticks in my mind: Lily, small now with a bandage on her arm, handing a folded paper to a juror who knocked on the railing. It was a picture she'd drawn of a garden with butterflies. The juror smiled and folded it into his pocket like a talisman. You'd be surprised at how often small gestures matter more than the loud lines. Verdict came down. Guilty. The word lands different ways depending on who you are. For us, it was relief and something else. A hollowness. Justice had been served in the way the system allows. A sentence would follow. And then there'd be appeals. And then there would be a complicated process of civil accountability. But justice, like grief, is not a single object. It's a series of moments where a community decides what it will tolerate. After the verdict, the neighborhood changed. Each letter from the HOA came with disclaimers. There were meetings about transparency, about how the board was elected, about term limits for officers. It was messy, like remodeling a house when the foundation is questionable. Some neighbors left unable to breathe in a place where the music now had a warped tone. Others stayed and tried to rebuild. We stayed because you don't always run from the place that hurt you. Sometimes you insist on making it livable. Lily's recovery was stubborn and unromantic. It was physical therapy that smelled like rubber bands and instruction. And it was therapy sessions where she learned to tell adults what she needed. It was also the small miracles, the way she learned to swing again, the way she took to painting with her fingers, the way she insisted on baking cookies and counted the seconds out loud while a timer ticked. She got better in pieces, like a mosaic. We learned to be patient with each fragment. People asked us if we forgave. That's a big word. Forgiveness is personal and messy. I know now that justice and forgiveness are not opposites. They're different rooms in the same house. You can walk from one to the other, but you have to decide if you want both. For me, forgiveness didn't erase the past. It meant not letting the past be the only thing that defined our future. For Lily, it meant learning to trust that the world could be kinder than it had been. There were nights I dreamed in legalese, the smell of paper, the echo of gavel, and there were nights where I dreamed of ordinary things. Lily running ahead of me in a grocery store, Laura humming while washing dishes. The two halves of life never fully married. But you learn to live with a split that keeps you whole enough. There were consequences for Marjorie beyond the courtroom. She lost her position in the HOA. Of course. She lost the polite nods she once took for granted. A civil suit followed. And there were donations clawed back from the charity she'd supported. The family split itself into careful statements and private rooms. Humans are political animals. They rearrange themselves when the map changes. What I want to be clear about, and what I think matters more than any legal detail, is that this story is about what a community tolerates. It's about how systems can shelter people who should not be sheltered. How neat rules can become rods to beat those who are different. And how courage often looks like an elderly neighbor stepping forward with trembling hands to say what she has seen. It's not a simple tale of good versus evil. People who hurt aren't always monsters. Sometimes they're people whose small cruelties piled up until damage was possible. That's not an excuse. It's a wake-up call. I also want you to understand that accountability doesn't always look like dramatic retribution. Sometimes it looks like a new bylaw, a transparency policy, a neighbor taking on a board position to make sure votes are fair. Sometimes it looks like families getting the help they need, or schools improving their staff training, or neighbors learning how to spot abuse that is quiet and institutional rather than loud and obvious. That's where the real work happens, in committees, in the careful, tedious work of boring holes in complacency so light can get through. There were moments that felt cinematic: the arrest, the courtroom, the press conferences, but those are not what stayed with me. What stayed was a small evening a year later when we were all in the backyard. Lily holding a paper plate of cake and teaching a friend how to clap properly, the way a blind child teaches you to hear applause before she feels it. She asked me, mid-bite, "Daddy, do you think people can get better?" I took a breath and said, "They can try." She nodded like that solved everything and went back to counting sprinkles. Kids have a way of simplifying things that is blindingly honest. If you're listening to this and you live near a homeowners association, or you're part of any group that has rules and power, ask yourself who benefits from the rules as written. Who is left out? Who is told to be neat while others are told to be quiet? These are the questions that prompt change. Don't wait for tragedy to make you look. I don't want to end with a tidy moral. Life isn't a sentence that wraps itself around a single point. But I do want you to think about one image: a child with a white cane tapping a rhythm on the pavement, a song in her mouth. People around her who see her for who she is and not for the way she disrupts a perfect hedge line. That's the work. That's the world worth building. So here's what I want from you, and please, be honest about it in the comments. Do you think the system did right by us? Was punishment enough? Was the change in the HOA enough? Or should communities have stricter oversight? What would you do if you witnessed small abuses in your own neighborhood? Share a story, a thought, even an angry sentence. I read every comment. Talk about justice. Talk about mercy. Talk about the awkward stuff, the things that don't make good headlines, but matter in backyards and kitchen tables. If this story struck something in you, tell someone. If you're part of a board or a committee, ask the hard questions. If you're someone who's been hurt, know this, your voice matters. If you're someone who's complacent, maybe start by listening. And one more thing, if you have a story about small town power, or a neighbor who used rules to hurt rather than to help, put it down below. We're all learning how to live beside one another. Sometimes, that starts with a single voice saying what it saw. Thanks for listening.